Hello, pup parents, and welcome to today's episode of the Perfect Pup Podcast. My name is Devin. I'm excited for this episode. We're going to talk about off leash and letting your dog off leash and answering the question, is it worth it? Because I think in our minds, we think that it's kind of this holy grail of being a pup parent, but it has its definite drawbacks. And I want to cover the pros and the cons of letting your dog off leash. So let's get right into it. First things first, we have to talk about leash laws. I'm going to put that under the cons list, the cons side of this argument, just because it really can limit where you are able to go. If you're dead set on letting your dog off leash, it really is going to limit the amount of places that you can maybe go explore or have adventures with your dog. Many hikes even require your dog to be on leash. Most parks require your dog to be on leash. All those good things. And I think it is important to do our best to follow all the leash laws that are around us. It's important for a lot of reasons. I do know that a lot of people aren't perfect in this regard, and I may not be perfect either, but I do think that it is important to follow the leash laws because number one, it's a law. Number two, it's typically there to protect you and other people and other dogs. So I'm going to put that under the cons list just in the sense that if you are wanting to follow leash laws, which you should, there is a high chance that this will limit the amount of places that you can go if you're wanting to take your dog off leash. The second con, and I really do think one of the biggest ones that people don't think about, is that you lose control of your dog when it comes to other dogs and other wildlife. Dogs are sometimes volatile creatures, and how they respond to every dog or every other animal that they come in contact with is going to be different. And even if you think, oh, generally my dog is good with other dogs, you don't know how another dog is going to behave towards your dog. And if your dog is off leash and that dog is off leash as well, potentially, it creates a situation where it can be very difficult to intervene if needed. And of course, you can always try and get in the middle of a dog fight, but that is dangerous. There is risk to you physically. My wife has been an emergency room nurse, and she has dealt with multiple people who had very serious injuries from trying to break up dog fights. So there is that risk. That is a con of taking your dog off leash, is that you don't know how every dog is going to interact with your dog, and even with other wildlife. If you are maybe out hiking somewhere and there's a cow or there's a deer, you don't know, or a more dangerous animal like a cougar or a mountain lion or a bear, you lose control of that situation. And let's be frank, even if your dog has a really, really good recall, even off leash, a lot of that kind of goes out the window when you're up against, for example, a bear. I know that's an extreme example, but it is realistic that those types of things can happen. And it's really difficult, almost impossible to train for those things beforehand. And so it is a risk that you are taking having your dog off leash. Another con that I do think is important to bring up is that bad habits can form. And I will speak on this from personal experience that it often, what I've seen, leads to your dog maybe, like, for example, chasing things that, generally speaking, or running off in certain directions, even if they're coming back to you and they have the recall, it can make it so that when they are on leash and they see those same positions presented to them, their brain starts to think, oh, I can chase after this thing, or oh, I can run that direction where I like to go. But then once they're on leash, maybe you've created kind of worse behaviors, bad habits of they're not checking in as frequently or whatever it might be. So again, that can vary from situation to situation, but it is something to be aware of, that, when your dog goes off leash, again, you have less control over potential bad habits that might pop up. And the fourth and kind of final point on the cons list before we get to the pros is that it presents dangerous situations for your dog. Again, you're losing control. And I'm going to say, I know we talked about other animals and other dogs, but I want to talk about bikes, skateboarders, cars, whatever it might be. If you're wanting to take your dog off leash in a place that it is legal, there is still the situation where, what if your dog runs off and they go towards a street, or they go towards, a bike path, and they're in people's way and it causes an accident? I know, like, it can seem like, well, I only go places where they're far away, but you just never know with our dogs. And I do think that is the ultimate kind of con to letting your dog off leash is it creates a lot of unknowns. It creates a lot of question marks of even if, hey, my dog is good with recall, they'll come back to me, they pay attention to me, I've done the work, I've done the practice, there is still just often a question mark. And I think no matter how you look at the pros and cons list of letting your dog off leash, there will always be inherent risk and truthfully danger in letting your dog off leash. So let's talk about the pros because there are a lot of pros. And I don't want this to be a never let your dog off leash podcast because that's not at all how I live my life. And that's not at all what I'm recommending for you necessarily. But those are good things that you need to ask yourself before you say, I'm going to let my dog off leash. Beware of the risk. So on the pros side of things, you'll see it's a very hard balance here because the pros are very, very strong pros for this, for taking your dog off leash. Number one is the freedom, and I think it's a mental thing. I try to not get into too much of just guessing or opinions or, well, my experience is this and having it be an end all. But what I've noticed with my dogs is, our dogs are pretty much all day long kind of being told what to do. I know that sounds harsh, but even however nice you are to your dog, hopefully you're very nice to your dog. There's a lot of kind of, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to go there. I need you to not do this. Like it's a lot happening at once. And I do think that mentally for our dogs, again, this is just kind of my own experience and my own um, viewing of my dogs and their behavior, but I do think it can be kind of a mental reset for them to get off leash. And that is why a lot of people, go to dog parks where they can be off leash, or other places where their dogs are allowed to be off leash because it gives your dog some real freedom. And I think that is important. And I think it allows our dogs to be dogs. I know I've talked about this before where, it's not, there's no perfect answer to, how much freedom you should give your dog and how much you should allow them to kind of do their own thing. But I do think that oftentimes we want to be in control of every situation and it can be overwhelming for our dogs. I think it's a lot for them to be constantly being told what to do. And I know that kind of sounds like a very interesting, strange way to think about it, but I have noticed in my dogs that when they're off leash, they seem to have like a personality change almost, like their mind, they feel just like they're acting a little differently. And that's just my own experience. Another pro, and this one I have no doubts on, is when your dog's off leash, they have the freedom to sniff a lot and get mental exercise. So I take my dogs running in Central Park. I live in New York City. I take my dogs running every day. And 95% of the time, I wake up early enough to take them during off leash hours. In Central Park, you can let your dogs run off leash before 9 a.m. and after 9 p.m. And I have noticed a tremendous increase in their tiredness, even just mentally, because when they're off leash and I go on my runs versus when I don't make it in that window of before 9 a.m. and they have to run with me on leash, they're sniffing. They are able to explore everywhere that they want to. And obviously, again, like we talked about, there are risks of that, but at the same time, that mental enrichment of just being able to sniff what they want, where they want, is extremely valuable. And I've noticed they come home way more tired. Even if I go the exact same distance, if they're off leash and they get that mental exercise, they're more tired. And on a similar note, a third pro for letting your dog off leash is they are going to run more, generally speaking. Again, uh, there's the risk of that, but also, when I go on for example, 3 mile run with my dogs, they typically run probably more like 4 miles, maybe 5, because they'll go up ahead a little bit and come back and then go to the side and come back and go forward and come back. And they're running. And, I'm running at a jogging pace, but they get to sprint when they want or run quickly. And that's just something you can't accomplish on leash unless you want to be constantly sprinting with your dog, which if you can handle that, hats off to you. Not something I want to do or can do. And the fourth pro, and really one that I do think, again, has its value, is not dealing with the leash. I think for leash walking and general leash behavior, it can be a very frustrating experience for pup parents between dog and human, where it can feel sometimes like a battle where it's like, even if your dog's doing well, even if your dog is pretty responsive, there's still moments where you're dealing with a leash. It can be annoying, for lack of a better word, as the pup parent. So I do think that is a pro to letting your dog off leash. So to recap, I can't answer for you if you should let your dog off leash in allowed off leash areas. That is something that you need to really, I think, give deep consideration before you just go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to do this. Obviously, even outside of what I've talked about, number one, your dog needs to have a reliable recall. And I don't mean, oh, it's pretty good or most of the time. I mean, even outside, from a distance with some distractions, your dog can come back to you. And I'll tell you what, it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. And it's not something that many dogs have right out the gate, if any. And so that is just something you need to think about. And that should be kind of top the top thought that you have when you decide if you're going to let your dog be off leash in allowed areas is, how reliable is their recall? How reliable are they listening to me outside around distractions? And as you weigh these pros and cons, I wanted to bring this up because I do think that, unfortunately, and I really try to be positive on this podcast, but there are a lot of instances that I've seen on whatever it be, social media, talking to people, you know, things that I've had in my own life where there is risk to taking your dog off leash, and there are very bad things that can happen if you let your dog off leash. And it isn't limited to, again, I really hate to talk about this, but there are a lot of dogs who get hit by cars. That is something that happens, and that is something that will happen until the end of time. And that risk, again, you have to think there's a lot of factors when you're about to take your dog off leash. But if you're anywhere near a road that might have cars or even bikes, it's a risk. It's a danger, because if your dog sprints off across the street after a squirrel or something like that, you can hope and you may believe that they're pretty well trained, but those instances, again, it's just a lot of variables, and there is a dangerous factor to letting your dog off leash. So let me say this as well. I let my dogs off leash. Like I said, I run through Central Park every morning. They're allowed to be off leash before 9 a.m. There is still some risk, and there are still moments where it makes me a little bit nervous, even though I'm very confident in their ability to listen to me and to come back to me. It's just, there's variables. There is, when you're allowing your dog more freedom, it brings up the opportunity of bad things could happen. And so it's just something, like, from one pup parent to another, that I want to put that into your mind and think about, of how confident are you in your dog's abilities, and are you okay with the risks? Because there are always risks to letting your dog off leash, even if it's as small as, hey, when they're on leash or I'm near them and they see deer poop and I tell them to leave it alone, they will. But off leash, I don't know, maybe they won't. Or if I'm not near them and don't even see it, they might get into poop. Those types of things. So, like, that's obviously not a giant risk, but it is something to think about. So I hope this gave you some good ideas on how you approach taking your dog off leash. I will say again, it's important to follow leash laws. So make sure you look them up if you're going on hikes or in your local area, whatever it might be. And generally speaking, again, I've said this before, train the dog in front of you. I can't tell you the answer. I gave you some good pros. I gave you some good cons. You have to think about it for yourself and decide what risks you're okay with, as well as, is the reward worth outweighing those risks. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it was a little more opinion based, but I hope it's something that can get you thinking and help you make a smart and informed decision about letting your dog off leash or not. And my final point, if you decide the risks aren't worth it, and you just truthfully don't know if you'll ever let your dog off leash in, a very wide open freedom type area, that's okay. No one is saying you have to have your dog off leash. I do think there is this misconception and this strange unspoken culture in the dog world of, I need to be able to let my dog off leash. My dog has to be good enough to have a recall off leash. And you know what? That's not true. Not every dog really truthfully should be off leash, and that's okay if that's the decision that you make. So thank you again for listening. If you haven't already, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's super helpful. I read every single one of them, and I really, truly appreciate when people leave reviews on this podcast. But other than that, we will catch you on the next episode.